And this is a slide that I put in all of the presentations about the SETT framework, looking at the student, the environments, the tasks, and the tools. And then we talk about equity as being that overlay, making sure that every student gets exactly what it is that they need. But today we're going to be talking all about the SETT framework and digging into that pretty deeply. The reason we do that is so that we can make sure that every student is truly getting what it is that they need. And of course, the SETT framework just looks at assistive technology, but it's actually a useful framework for other things too. This was from the registration information about how familiar people are with the SETT framework, everywhere from 1, this is the first I've heard of it, all the way up to 5, I could teach people about this. So people were kind of in the middle on that and leaning towards 4, so that's great news. And then when I asked people what they wanted to do in this session, the biggest one was getting a review of how each of these elements looks. So that's what we'll spend the majority of the time doing, but I've also got a case study in there and links to some forms that we can take a look at too. All right, so how do we look at each element? And like I said, feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions. That'll help guide this to be exactly what it is that you need today. All right, so the first thing we have to do is gather information. We'll talk about the forms and things that we can do that on, but some general ideas about how you can gather information. Part of this is you might have a lot of information already from previous testing and data and information that you have. Say, for example, you just did a 3-year reevaluation, or it's an initial evaluation. You've got a lot of information at your fingertips already. The same thing goes for present levels of performance. If it's a student already receiving service, that's going to be a lot of your information actually within looking at the SETT framework. You can use both quantitative and qualitative data. We know there are multiple ways of knowing information, but that data within the quantitative area can really be helpful in showing growth. The qualitative information is going to be important too, some of those more subjective items. You can, of course, gather information doing observations of a student in different settings. You can do trials, and a really important piece is going to be the input from team members. That could be using a form that your district, school, or co-op uses, or using, I'll share some today too that come from other sources. And of course, you're going to make sure that you get input from multiple people working with the student. Of course, the student information is important, and the parents, teacher, para, staff, all of those people are going to have good information to provide regarding the students. So first, we'll look through each element of the SETT framework. So the first one is student, that's the S. And some of the questions that we ask are, what are some of the general areas of concern? We'll get more specific in the tasks, but these are kind of those general areas of concern, like reading, writing, math, activities of daily living, kind of those general areas. You'll see the list on some of the forms that we'll look at. What are the students' abilities in that area? Again, a lot of that you might already have from present levels. What are the students' strengths? What are some things that they're really good at so that we can build on those things? And then what are the students' interests? That's a really important piece that I think sometimes gets overlooked in this process. We then look at the environments, and the first question to ask is, what are all the environments or spaces that the student is in on a pretty regular basis? So even within school, that can be places like one classroom if you're in an elementary school to 6 or 7 classrooms if you're in a middle or high school. Those can vary greatly, so it's important to identify all of those. Of course, you've got things like, depending on your school setting right now, this might be a lot at home, especially if you're in distance learning. The home is always another important place too, though. Community spaces. And back to within the school, of course, that could be things like the cafeteria or lunchroom. Are they doing things in the gym? Again, depending on what your schools are doing at this point. Another thing that's important about the environment is not just the physical environment, but who are the other people there? Are there, 5 other students at a time, or are there 40 other students at a time? Is there one teacher, or is there one teacher and 4 paras? The people in the environment can greatly impact what that environment looks like. Of course, you want to look at the physical layout of the environment. Um, some of those are the more obvious pieces that when we think about the environment. Are there access issues in the environment? Can this student get to all the spaces within the environment and access the items within the environment? More things about the environment. What are the expectations? What is the student expected to do? What does the student expect themselves to do? What do the parents want the student to do? All of those things fall under the expectations in the environment, sort of those rules you can think of it as too. What technology is already available in the environment? If there are things that we can leverage that are already in place, that just makes things a whole lot easier. And it's also then becomes a less restrictive environment when we're thinking about LRE. Sometimes this area gets skimmed over, but it can have really big impacts. For instance, if someone's looking at a communication device, like we've got Jack here looking at communication devices. If the volume on that device isn't loud enough and you're going to be using it in the cafeteria or out in the gym, on the playground, you'd want to make sure that you had something that had a loud enough volume to do that. So just one example of where the environment might be a very important factor. All right, then we start to dig into the tasks. What are the exact tasks that the team is hoping to target? The more specific you can be, the better, and the easier it'll be once you get to the tools section of this framework. It can be that you're wanting to increase accuracy or independence within any of those tasks. Eventually, this will be tied to IEP goals and objectives, driven by those needs. We talk about the flow charts of everything moving from present levels into the IEP. That's that step. And the same thing happens with AT. When you determine those needs, then you want to tie that into your goals and objectives, and then the AT gets tied to that piece. Again, be as specific as possible. Sometimes when we talk about the general areas, we might say something like reading, but it's, or even decoding grade level text, but that's still not enough information to determine exactly which tool is needed. It makes a big difference if you're trying to decode hard copy text versus digital text. Is it a one sentence thing, or is it a, science textbook? So all those things within that can affect which tools get chosen eventually. Then we get into the tools. This is the part that I think people think of as assistive technology. And sometimes we want to start here, or at least often we'll have an inkling of what we'd like to trial. A lot of people will reach out to me and say, hey, I want to trial a C-Pen or whatever it is. And it's like, well, let's back up a second and see if that's exactly the tool that would be the best place to start. I'm always a fan of trying multiple things, but there's no reason to set ourselves up for a difficult situation. So we want to make sure that the tool actually fits the student and the environments and the tasks. It'll help with that device fit and usage. Sometimes we run into abandonment issues where we have someone abandon the technology because it's not working. And sometimes it's because we didn't look closely enough in finding that fit. So making sure that that's really a good fit. And then we do feature matching. Again, that's looking at those very specific features within a tool to make sure that it fits the student, the environment, and the tasks. As an example, if you have to scan and read hard copy text for a student who has difficulty with reading hard copy text, it might be a dynamic screen AAC device, an alternative communication device, with those specific things within it that we need. Might be that the writing tools need to be a larger diameter, bigger items to grasp. So it's those specific features of that item that we're looking for when we start considering tools. Okay, so before we go into forms, does anyone have any questions about those elements that I just kind of whipped through in terms of looking at the student, the environment, the task, and then the tools? when we're going through the SETT framework. All right. Hearing none, I will move on to the next one. But again, feel free to unmute and interrupt me or type in the chat window, whatever's comfortable. We're going to look at a few forms. And I think what I'm going to have you guys do is I'll bring them up on the screen, but I want you to keep in mind sort of your situation, the students that you work with. Many of you here are from the Duluth Public Schools, and so we have a specific form that we use, but I just want to give everyone a general idea of the other forms out there. So even if these aren't forms that you might be using specifically, be thinking about whether there's an element of that that might be helpful for your AT consideration. So the first page there, I start off with some items from Joy Zabala. I actually should have given her credit at the beginning. She is the person who years ago kind of came up with the idea of the SETT framework. I think it was working with some other individuals also, but she is kind of the voice in SETT framework development and design. And so I would have been remiss if I didn't include a couple of items that she has shared out in her information: the SETT scaffold for gathering data and the SETT scaffold for AT consideration. So I'll pop those up on the screen. They're going to be small. Again, if you have the links there for yourself, it might be helpful. But this first one, you can see this is the one for gathering data. And it has, the student, the environment, the tasks, and then it had within each of those, it gives you information about how to collect that data and what data might be helpful to collect. Then down below, there's an empty form where you can fill in your information as a team. They suggest that you circle the functional areas of concern, underline the barriers, and star the supports, so that you can kind of pull that information out visually. But again, so that's just some information on how to collaboratively gather and look at the information. The second one from Joy Zabala is the SETT scaffold for consideration of AT needs. And this is kind of similar to what all of us here today actually have in place for our districts or co-ops for an AT consideration guide. So I won't go through this one too in depth, but you'll see the areas for consideration, and then she goes into the specific steps that that people can go through to consider that. Here she's talking about it, considering it in all the environments, and again, you'll see this is just another example of how those pieces can be documented. So back to our slides. MDE, the Minnesota Department of Education, also has an assistive technology manual, and it is a thick manual, all-encompassing, but within this, there is a section on the SETT framework, and that is down on page 16. And so it goes through multiple areas of the SETT framework, what questions to ask within that. Those are very similar to what we just went through. Talks about how it's used to access tools. Does it require a specific process? It says no, but it's a framework. And then it looks at what are the important components of the SETT framework. So again, I won't go through those too specifically here, but just know that that MDE manual can be a good resource for you. The WADI is a very involved assessment package. It hasn't been updated in some time, but they also have a lot of information in there. I won't show that one to you, but just as you can see, page 52 is where you look for the SETT information. So you'll see that it's a very lengthy, in-depth resource that you've got there. Of course, there are regional and local forms. So for us here today, Duluth Public Schools and Northern Lights, both of those I've got listed there so that you can see what those AT consideration forms look like. They're very, very similar. And then if you're watching this as a recorded video, if you aren't sure what your forms look like or what your district or co-op or school uses, make sure that you check with your TOSAs, your coordinators, or your directors if you aren't sure where to find your specific forms. I'll bring up the Duluth Public Schools one just to show a little bit of that. But basically, it walks you through with some more specific questions describing the student. Again, considering those general areas of concern, then looking specifically at the tasks, identifying the environments, and then looking at the tools. Here, the next few steps is looking at documenting and making a plan for what's going to happen next within that. Um, on this one, the ISD 709 form, we also have possible examples of tools that might help. Again, making sure that you look at the top part of the form before moving on to the second part of the form that has some general and some specific examples of things that might be helpful in each of those situations. Okay, so that was a whirlwind whip through look at any of the forms that might be helpful. Again, you've got links to those in the slides, but any questions about the forms? Okay, not seeing any. In the Duluth Public Schools, just FYI, we are doing our AT Teams project this year in our year 2 is looking at the use of our AT consideration form. So we'll be looking at doing revisions on that. So if anyone has any suggestions for revisions upcoming, definitely let me know.
Julie, I was just going to say, the Northern Lights forms, Julie Ray was kind enough to let us copy hers and modify them a little bit. So great forms that Julie had to start with. So we're really appreciative that we had those, and ours are very similar.
Thanks so much, Shannon. Yeah, we actually, as the Duluth Public Schools AT team, developed those years and years ago now, I guess. So yeah, we figured, hey, we did great work developing those. There's no need to reinvent the wheel, and so we appreciate that credit. Thank you. And always looking to make sure that we're doing what's useful for people. So if as you're using this form, you're like, boy, that element of it just isn't helpful, or I need more information on that, or less, just let me know. Always looking for helpful, constructive feedback. All right. So that's it on forms. I do have a case study here. I think what I'm going to do is have you all take a peek at that rather than walking you through it and trying to read it aloud. I know you can read more quickly as you just read it there. So you can either type in that bit.ly link there or click on the link, and I will bring it up on the screen, but I'm going to just pause for a minute and minute or two and have you take a quick read through that. Okay, so hopefully you've gotten a chance to at least skim through most of that. If not, you can keep on going. Know that, of course, this is not necessarily the most complete form. Just wanted to put out some ideas there to get you thinking. But I'm curious what your thoughts are as you went through that, whether there are, I mean, either feel free to share any just general thoughts, or I would love to hear if there are things that surprised you or items that you think that you would do differently. Again, feel free to interrupt me. You can unmute yourself and yeah, go ahead, Jack. I see you unmuted there.
Yeah, I guess it would be nice to know kind of his comprehension level, just as the student, because that would help us down the road further. Because it looks like the expression is listed, if I read that right, but not the comprehension level.
Beautiful. Yes. So that is definitely something you'd want to get more information on from the student. Good point. Something I want to point out on this too is that you'll notice in areas of concern, we've got just about everything highlighted there. No vision or hearing concerns, but because they are all concerns and some needs came up, but that does not necessarily mean that we are going to target all of those things within assistive technology. If there are needs and areas that we feel like we can target, then for sure you're going to include all of those here. Partially, I did this for the sake of an example, so you wouldn't have 17 pages of reading. But also, just know that sometimes there are accommodations or modifications that already address these things in a student's IEP. So there's not necessarily a need to rehash all of these areas if the needs are being met in different ways, whether that's through instructional needs or other supports. And there is a space, of course, down on in section 7, are those things helping? And if they are, you can go ahead and document them. So yeah, when you're talking about that in boxes 6 and 7 on this particular form, just know that sometimes those pieces don't necessarily need what would traditionally be considered assistive technology if there are other ways that those needs are being met. All right, anything else about this form or the case sample? Or does anyone want to bring up a case study that they've got? I know no one said that they did in the registration form, but if there are any students that you can think of that you would like to kind of walk through right now, I'm open to that too. All right, if not, I'll keep moving through the slides here. We kind of did Q&A as we went along here. Just a reminder that always all of our sessions are put up on the YouTube channel that you can watch if you aren't able to catch one live. And as you walk away today, I would like you to think about what is just one thing that you can take away that might help you moving forward in the context of the SETT framework. Is there one student that you think, boy, I could really do a more thorough look at the student, the environments, the tasks, and then the tools? Maybe it's using this form or looking at some of those other forms, but just be thinking about what is the one thing that you're going to walk away today doing. Just a reminder again, next week is Stacia Spees doing a Boom Cards follow-up. So that'll be a great one. Registration information will be coming out today. And a huge thank you to all of you for attending this and all the work that you're doing regarding assistive technology. I know there's a lot going on right now, so that's greatly appreciated. You'll get a recording of this session emailed to you, and there's my email there, as I know you guys all have that though. I'll go ahead and stop the recording now, but I will hang around and make sure that I answer any questions or